The unseen battle begins when neighbors become enemies. It's a quiet, sleepy suburban neighborhood, where the sounds of chirping birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind are the most common disturbances. At least that's how it should be. But for me, a simple life and peaceful mornings were quickly becoming a distant memory. Instead, I found myself battling an invisible enemy, someone who, on the surface, might seem harmless but has far more power than she deserves. Her name? Karen. And she wasn't just any Karen. She was the HOA president. It was a regular morning when I had finished my exhausting 12-hour overnight shift at the local hospital, the kind of shift where you lose track of time and barely remember your own name. All I wanted was a cup of coffee and a chance to sink into the comfort of my couch, hopefully getting some sleep before the day's duties started again. But as I turned onto my street, the sight that greeted me was far from normal. Right there in my driveway, blocking my path to the front door, was a shiny silver SUV that didn't belong. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor's friend, or perhaps someone in need of a temporary parking spot. But as I approached the vehicle, confusion began to turn into frustration. There was no note, no explanation, and definitely no sign of an emergency. Just a random car sitting in my private space. My driveway wasn't just some random space for anyone to use. It was where I kept the safety of my elderly father, who depended on easy access for his walker. So, I did what anyone would do. I left a polite note under the windshield wiper. It was a simple request, just asking the owner not to park there again. Surely this would solve the issue, but it didn't. The next morning, the same SUV was sitting there again, like it had every right to be. And this time, my polite note had been crumpled and tossed aside like it didn't even matter. That's when I knew things were about to get a lot more complicated. A battle of nerves and rights. I won't lie, by this point, I was beyond annoyed. There's something deeply unsettling about people who disregard the simplest common courtesies. And the fact that this person had just ignored my note, not once but twice, left me wondering whether they even understood the concept of respect. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random inconsiderate driver. No. This was personal. Soon enough, I found out who the culprit was. It was none other than Karen, the newly elected HOA president, a woman who seemed to think that she had the authority to control everyone's lives in our neighborhood. From the stories I'd heard, Karen was the type who had way too much time on her hands and too little understanding of boundaries. She had a reputation for micromanaging, sending violation notices over minor issues like grass being half an inch too long, or a fence being painted the wrong shade of white. But this, parking in my driveway without permission, that was the last straw. When I confronted her about it, she brushed me off, arrogantly claiming that the street parking situation in our neighborhood was awful and that, as HOA president, she had every right to park anywhere she wanted. She told me, in no uncertain terms, that I didn't own the street. Well, I wasn't about to let this slide, especially when it was affecting my father's safety, escalating the situation from passive aggression to full-on war. For a while, I thought she might have gotten the hint when she stopped parking in my driveway, but this piece was short-lived. Soon after, I found her SUV parked not just in my driveway again, but in a way that completely blocked my father's access ramp. I tried again to talk to her, calmly explaining the urgency of the situation. But Karen didn't care. Instead, she rolled her eyes and dismissed my concerns. She claimed that I was making a big deal out of nothing, and if anything, I should be grateful for her help. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I had tried politeness. I had tried reasoning. But now this wasn't just about my driveway. This was about standing up for what was right. I wasn't going to let her get away with using my property for her personal gain, no matter who she was. It was time to take matters into my own hands. But how? How could I legally stop her from using my driveway as her personal parking space? That's when I remembered a conversation I had once had with a friend, Dan, who worked as a property dispute lawyer. Dan had always been passionate about property rights and had shared some valuable advice with me about the power of private property ownership. "You can have her towed, no problem," he had said. "It's within your legal rights." And that's exactly what I did. The sweet taste of victory. For now, I won't lie, There was a part of me that hesitated at first. It wasn't just about the legal right to tow her car. It was about making a point. It was about showing Karen that her position in the HOA didn't give her free rein to bully her neighbors. And when the tow trucks arrived and I saw her precious SUV being hauled away, I have to admit, a small part of me felt victorious. But I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. No, this was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle. The next few hours were a blur as Karen came marching over, furious, demanding an explanation. Her words were filled with accusations of harassment and illegal actions. She claimed that I was violating her rights as HOA president, and she even threatened to report me to the authorities. But I stayed calm, showing her the photos of her car parked on my property and explaining that she was, in fact, trespassing. The police had been called, but when they arrived, they backed me up, confirming that I had the legal right to have her car towed. The real twist came when Karen tried to escalate the situation further by making a false report about my property. She tried to turn the tables, but little did she know, I was ready for her. Why this story is more than just a parking dispute. At first glance, this might just seem like a petty neighborhood squabble, a case of an entitled neighbor who refuses to respect boundaries. But at its core, this story is about the power dynamics in communities, the lengths some people will go to for control, and how sometimes standing up for yourself can have far-reaching consequences. What started as a simple parking dispute escalated into a full-blown confrontation that challenged everything I thought I knew about my rights as a homeowner. In the coming chapters of this story, I'll break down how I used the law to defend my home, what steps I took to ensure Karen could no longer abuse her position, and the moment when I realized that my fight wasn't just about parking spaces. It was about taking back control. The fight for control, the tension rises. The calm that followed the towing of Karen's SUV was brief and deceptive. For a moment, I allowed myself to think that maybe she had learned her lesson. Maybe, just maybe, she would back off and accept that I wasn't someone she could trample over. But deep down, I knew that Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily. She wasn't the type of person who could tolerate losing. Losing wasn't in her vocabulary, and I had no doubt that my actions, however justified, had planted the seeds of a deeper conflict. As the days passed, I tried to focus on my father, on my hospital shifts, and on reclaiming a sense of normalcy. But that's when I realized just how far Karen was willing to go. The moment I thought I had regained control of the situation, she threw another curveball my way. I came home from a short grocery run one afternoon, expecting nothing more than to relax for a bit before the next hospital shift. But what I found when I turned into my driveway was nothing short of infuriating. Karen, never one to back down, had parked not one, but two cars in my driveway. She had completely blocked my access to the front door, and the worst part? She had done it without a second thought, without even attempting to explain or apologize. The audacity of it was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the parking. It wasn't just about my property. It was about Karen's ongoing attempt to exert power over me, to challenge my right to live peacefully in my own home. She was sending a clear message. She wasn't done. And I wasn't about to let this continue. The retaliation escalates. The battle for boundaries. At first, I tried to handle the situation calmly. I knocked on Karen's door, hoping for a peaceful resolution. I wanted to explain, once again, the importance of keeping my driveway clear for my father. But as soon as she opened the door and saw me, I could tell that the situation had gone beyond reasoning. Karen wasn't interested in compromising. She wasn't interested in finding a solution. Instead, she saw me as the problem, and her eyes gleamed with the kind of arrogance that could only come from someone who thought they were above it all. "Your father can just walk around it," she told me, dismissing the issue as though it were some petty inconvenience. I had tried to play by the rules. I had tried to reason with her. But I was done. I wasn't going to stand there and allow her to disrespect me or my father any longer. The time for patience had passed. I had warned her. I had tried to be polite. But she had refused to listen. Now I needed to act decisively. That's when I decided to call in the tow trucks once again. This time I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I was done being her doormat, done being the neighbor she could bully. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was ready to fight fire with fire. As I dialed the number for the towing company, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. I had a legal right to remove the vehicles from my driveway, and I wasn't about to let her continue to walk all over me. My nerves were high, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I wasn't just defending my property. I was defending my family's safety, my father's well-being, and my peace of mind. The tow truck arrived swiftly, and I watched as Karen's precious cars were loaded onto the rig and hauled away. It was oddly satisfying, watching her cars, which had once sat so arrogantly in my driveway, now disappear into the distance. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't just let this go. She'd be back with some new plan, some new way to try and assert her control over me. The fallout, Karen's response, and the escalation of tensions. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Karen to show up on my doorstep. She was livid, shaking with fury, clutching her phone as though it were some sort of weapon. "You towed my cars," she screamed. Her voice was filled with disbelief and rage. I kept my composure, maintaining a calm, collected stance. "Yes, you parked in my driveway again, and you didn't have permission. It's trespassing. I had no choice but to have your vehicles removed," I explained, keeping my tone level. But Karen wasn't done. She wasn't going to let me off the hook that easily. She immediately began accusing me of theft, claiming that I had stolen her car. She even threatened to call the police, hoping to turn the situation in her favor. But once again, I had the law on my side. I had photo evidence of her parking in my driveway without permission, and the police had already told her that I was within my legal rights to have the vehicles towed. When the officers arrived, Karen went into full victim mode, claiming that I had been harassing her and that I was out of line. But the officers quickly shut her down. They confirmed that I was legally allowed to have the vehicles removed, and they warned Karen about making false reports. I could see the realization dawn on her. She wasn't going to win this battle. But instead of accepting defeat, Karen doubled down. She wasn't going to give up that easily. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a long and drawn-out war of wills. Turning the tables, the final straw. As much as I tried to avoid escalating things further, Karen just kept coming back, each time with a more ridiculous request, a more absurd violation, or a new attempt to exert her so-called authority. It seemed like the more I stood my ground, the more she tried to push back. But I was no longer intimidated. In fact, I was more determined than ever to ensure that my rights as a homeowner were respected. Then, one Saturday morning, I was met with the final straw. I opened my curtains and saw not just one, but two of Karen's cars parked in my driveway. This time, she had completely blocked me in, making it impossible for my father to get in and out of the house. I didn't hesitate for a moment. I called the tow truck again, and within minutes, Karen's vehicles were gone. When Karen came running out, red-faced and screaming, I was ready for her. This time, I wasn't just defending my property. I was defending my peace of mind and my family's well-being. I stayed calm as Karen raged, her face twisting with anger and disbelief. She accused me of everything from theft to harassment, but nothing she said could change the fact that she was trespassing. As the tow trucks drove off with her cars once again, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. This time, Karen had been forced to confront the fact that her position as HOA president didn't grant her the right to trample on other people's rights. The resolution bringing the HOA tyrant to justice. The peace I had hoped for after the second tow didn't last long. As much as I had hoped that Karen would back off after the last confrontation, I could tell that her pride was too fragile for her to let this go. The more I resisted, the harder she tried to push me back into my place in the neighborhood. I knew at this point that I wasn't dealing with just an entitled neighbor. I was dealing with a self-appointed queen who had been abusing her power for far too long. Karen's next move, however, would be her biggest mistake yet. The last straw, Karen's desperation. One morning, after a long night shift at the hospital, I was exhausted but ready to rest. As I stumbled to my front door, still bleary-eyed, I was greeted by a sight that made my stomach drop. Karen, with a team of contractors, standing at the edge of my property. She was directing them to dig up my yard. The audacity. She had called in workers to repair the underground pipes in my driveway, without informing me, without any notice, and without any authorization. This was not a simple mistake or misunderstanding. It was a blatant act of trespassing. She had crossed a line that could not be ignored. I marched outside, fuming, trying my hardest not to let my temper get the best of me. As I confronted Karen, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice. She was trying to invade my personal space, disrupt my home, and, worst of all, create chaos for my elderly father. She thought she could pull some strings as the HOA president, but this time I wasn't going to back down. "Stop right there," I commanded. The workers froze, looking nervously at me. The realization of the situation slowly began to dawn on them. "You're not authorized to be here. You're trespassing," I told them. I pulled out my badge to emphasize my point, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they began to pack up their tools. Karen, however, wasn't about to give up without a fight. She stormed up to me, clearly enraged. "You have no right to stop this work. The HOA authorized it," she shouted, hands on her hips, trying to act like she was the one in control. I stood my ground. "The HOA can't just come onto private property and start digging up the yard. You have no legal right to do this." Karen's face turned bright red, her hands shaking as she realized her bluff was up. "Get off my property," I said firmly. For the first time, Karen's arrogance seemed to falter. The workers quickly packed up their tools and left, and Karen was left standing there, humiliated. She huffed, spun around, and walked away, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Karen was a fighter, a stubborn one at that. She wouldn't just go quietly. I was prepared for whatever she had in store next. The final showdown, the HOA meeting. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Karen fired back with another attempt to bully me into submission. This time, she used her position as the HOA president to try and get me evicted from my own home. She filed a formal complaint, accusing me of violating the neighborhood's codes and disturbing the peace of the community. She tried to get a disciplinary meeting scheduled, where she would try to convince the board members to vote me out of the neighborhood. The meeting was set for Friday evening, and I made sure to attend. I wasn't going to let Karen win this one. I knew that if I didn't stand up for myself, if I didn't push back against this blatant overreach, she would only escalate the situation further. As I entered the meeting room, I could feel the tension in the air. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to Karen's manipulations were now beginning to question her actions. Some were starting to realize that her reign of terror wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about control, and it was time for that to end. Karen was at the front of the room, armed with a stack of papers and her usual smug smile. She began by explaining how I had been disrupting the neighborhood, and how my actions had caused unnecessary conflict. I could tell she was trying to play the victim as usual, but this time I wasn't buying it. I stood up and interrupted her, my voice steady but firm. "You can't just make up rules as you go along, Karen. The HOA has no authority to remove me from my home. You can't throw people out of their own neighborhood because you don't like them." The room went silent as the truth hung in the air. Karen tried to defend herself, but the room wasn't with her anymore. Some of the neighbors were nodding in agreement. Others were looking at her with suspicion. She was losing her grip on the situation, and she knew it. Turning the tables, Karen's fall from power. As the meeting continued, I presented my evidence. Photos of the parking violations, copies of the notes I had left on Karen's car, the towing receipts, and even my legal rights as a property owner. I methodically dismantled her arguments, piece by piece, showing that Karen had been abusing her position of power for far too long. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for every person in the neighborhood who had ever been threatened, fined, or harassed by her. And the more I spoke, the more the tide turned in my favor. By the end of the meeting, Karen was defeated. The board voted to remove her from her position as HOA president, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from her grasp. But Karen didn't take her loss well. She didn't walk away quietly. She stormed out of the meeting, cursing under her breath. But it didn't matter. The power had shifted. The aftermath, a new beginning. The days after the meeting felt like a breath of fresh air. Karen had been stripped of her authority, and the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board implemented new rules, ones that were fair and respected everyone's rights. No more unreasonable fines. No more invasive inspections. No more being harassed for petty things like grass height or driveway parking. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't done. She tried to appeal her removal, but it was too late. The community had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let her bully anyone ever again. Eventually, Karen was forced to sell her house and move out of town. It was the only option she had left. As for me, I had learned a valuable lesson in standing my ground, even when the odds were stacked against me. The law may have its flaws, but in the end, it was my rights as a homeowner that prevailed. Lessons learned and moving forward. This story is about more than just a petty HOA dispute. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the person on the other side is trying to make your life miserable. It's about refusing to be intimidated by people who believe they can control others. And ultimately, it's about knowing your rights and using them to protect yourself and those you love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And let me know what you think. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have stood up to Karen like I did? Or would you have tried to avoid the conflict? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay strong, stay confident, and remember, sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to show them that you're not afraid to fight back.